This is our next iteration of, thank you so much, gender justice and the front lines of gender justice. And today we're really lucky to have Dana Sussman joining us. Archie, that's so great. We can't read it, but I know what it says. Dana is the acting executive director of Pregnancy Justice, a newish name for an organization that was known for a long time as National Advocates for Pregnant Women. And just in terms of the trajectory of her career and work, she and I went to the same fantastic law school, which was not Columbia Law School, Northeastern Law School. We wanted to be public interest lawyers, and guess what we became? And you can do that too by going to Columbia. So you don't have to go to Northeastern. So she went to Northeastern. She had a fellowship right out of law school at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and then did a clerkship after that fellowship in the Eastern District of New York, and then went from that to being an associate at Outen and Golden, which is a fantastic employee side, labor side employment and labor firm, which she can say a little bit about if she wants. And then from there, be a staff attorney at Safe Horizons, where she was working in their anti-trafficking project. And then from there, had this fantastic title of Deputy Commissioner of Policy and Intergovernmental Affairs at the New York City Commission on Human Rights, where I also worked in the 1980s, and we have a very similar, some respect, professional career, which she left a couple of years ago to join the Pregnancy Justice as their deputy director, and has stepped in as acting executive director. And so lots of really interesting jobs and amazing work, hard work to be sure. So thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about Pregnancy Justice. What do you all do? What's your mission? How's it going?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I know I have a hard act to follow. You've had some amazing speakers, many friends and colleagues in this work, so I'll do my best. But Pregnancy Justice was founded in the early 2000s. And it was founded by our founder and executive director because she was at sort of the mainstream repro orgs like the Center for Reproductive Rights. Back then it was called the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy and the ACLU. And she started getting these cases in the 80s and 90s of women who were being charged with crimes in connection to their pregnancies. So it was the war on drugs meets the war on abortion, and sort of the rise of mass incarceration and mass criminalization and targeting primarily Black pregnant people involved with using substances and being pregnant. And it essentially created a whole area of criminal law that would not apply to anyone else but pregnant people. So by becoming pregnant, you become vulnerable to the application of criminal laws that don't apply to any other subset of the population. And this was the idea that what's rooted in all of this is the idea that a fetus is a child. So prosecutors, primarily starting in southern states, were prosecuting poor pregnant folks with child abuse for mostly at the time it was cocaine, exposing their fetus to some perceived risk of harm in utero. So you really did see this idea, this hyper stigmatization of drug use, this hysteria around so-called the crack baby epidemic, which has been entirely debunked. The use of junk science, the use of racism and misogyny, and this tropes around who are deserving mothers and who are not deserving mothers, and started criminalizing pregnant folks for using substances. No other organization was really taking this up. Most of the organizations at the time were really focused, rightfully so, on maintaining the right to abortion, which was also under attack at the time. And so our founder and ED set up her own organization to focus on this issue. And we've been doing that work ever since. Our work sort of falls into, I'd say, 4 pillars. We're small, so that's a lot of pillars, but 4 pillars. The first is criminal defense. So none of us, I think, start out as criminal defense attorneys in this work. We sort of all see ourselves as reproductive rights or justice lawyers, but very quickly we become sort of steeped in the patterns of these cases, the reliance on illegitimate science, on stigma, on getting in histories around people's reproductive lives and decisions. We work with medical experts and advocates locally to ensure that people get robust defenses in their cases. We organize amicus briefs, we organize press strategy and outreach. We support the defendant however we can. And so criminal defense is one main pillar. Another pillar of our work is policy advocacy. So we can't do a ton as a 501c3, but we can voice our opposition to bills that seek to criminalize the pregnant person. So in the repro landscape, we really focus on the pregnant person. We're not the ones who are defending the doctors or the clinics or the helpers, like the abortion funds. We really do focus on the pregnant person. So every once in a while, and more frequently now, we see laws that are being, or bills that are being discussed that explicitly criminalize the pregnant person, whether it's seeking an abortion, or using drugs and being pregnant, or something else along those lines. And we oppose those laws. We oppose attempts to create fetal personhood in state statute. And I can talk a little bit about that and how that's becoming more and more common. And we also promote and support really good laws, which actually do happen occasionally, and more so now as states become galvanized around these issues. Last year, California passed a great law that clarifies that they cannot use their criminal laws to criminalize a pregnant person for their pregnancy outcomes. That had to be clarified in California law because we're still seeing cases in California. So we support progressive, protective legislation. Another pillar of our work is research and documentation. So we document every case of pregnancy-related criminalization that we can find in the country, and we've been able to identify almost 2,000 cases since 1973, since the Roe decision, and we'll be publishing a lot of our updated research later this year. And that's really important because we can track trends. We understand where the hot spots are. Because we have limited resources, we know we should focus in a particular area, not even a particular state, but even a particular county. This is so prosecutor to prosecutor dependent that one county in a particular state might have a dozen cases at any given moment, and another county hasn't prosecuted a case like this in years. So we really use that data to help direct our work, and also so people know that this is happening. I don't think most people have any idea that this is happening. And then our fourth pillar, let's see, advocacy, we do organizing and education. So we work across disciplines. That's really important to us. Almost every one of our cases starts in a hospital or medical setting. So who do we need to talk to? We need to talk to the doctors and the hospital-based social workers and the child welfare workers. The pipeline is almost always medical provider to family regulation system to police. So not only do we see criminal cases, but we see family regulation system cases in most of our cases where there's children. And so we work across those disciplines. We talk to family regulation system workers and doctors, medical examiners who have a role to play in this, criminal defense attorneys and getting them prepared, public defenders, and then also prosecutors and police. I've even sat down with prosecutors and talked to them about this stuff. Not sure how effective it is, but we will do it. And so we really do a ton of training and outreach and education, and we try to shift narrative around this as well. More people are getting these connections finally, probably because of the Dobbs decision, between criminalization and reproductive rights and justice. But we continue to try and build those connections and make sure that people understand that when you lose the right to abortion, it's not just about the right to abortion. It's about the right to have healthy pregnancies. It's about the right to parent the children that you give birth to. It's about the right to not be criminalized because of experiencing a pregnancy loss. The rights of all pregnant people are at stake, not just those who seek abortion. So it's all connected, and that's sort of a lot of the work that we try to do is build those connections.
Thank you. I've worked for years with Lynn Paltrow, we should say her name, the founder, who is stepping down now, and the search is on for a new director. But Lynn and I are old friends, and I remember talking to her early on as she was doing this work about how no one was showing up in these cases, that the reproductive rights movement understood its work to be about abortion and access to contraception, et cetera. And the criminal justice people and the criminal defense bar had a whole different set of people who were implicated in the so-called war on drugs, but in very different ways. And so it was an incredible intersection of those dynamics that Lynn had the foresight to create this organization and build it into the powerhouse that it is today. But there was always this sense, even when I would talk to funders who I knew funded NAPW or Pregnancy Justice, of, oh, that's over there. This is a problem for the most disadvantaged pregnant people, women of color, low-income women, and it's not a mainstream issue. It's those on the margins who are unique in some way. And as you said a moment ago, that wasn't true then, but it's especially not true now, given that the criminal law is being deployed, weaponized in so many ways for everybody. And I'm wondering how that's changing your work, changing the attention that your organization is getting. Is it helping, or is it overwhelming and kind of a burden in a way?
Yeah. Well, I think it's helping in some ways. I think more people seem to care. More people, like I said, understand the connections in this work, are starting maybe to see themselves more and more in our cases. We had a case that just went public this week where a woman, I mean, it's sort of like a combination of every issue that you've been discussing over the past few weeks, I imagine, but she had 2 children. She lost custody of her 2 older children when she gave birth to them in the hospital because she tested positive for drugs. The Carpenter case. Oh, right. You read this. Yes. So sorry. I sent the materials over like weeks ago. So, but there's a very long article about the case in The Guardian that came out yesterday. So I encourage you to read it. Kelsey talks about her story for the first time. We actually think we're on the offensive now. We think that the prosecutor we timed the story very intentionally. Yeah, it's all of the levels or layers to these systems. So she lost her two children to, luckily there's been a kinship placement, so she still sees her kids, but she lost her 2 children to because she had tested positive for drugs. She struggled with drug use and her whole adult life. And she chose to have a home birth with her 3rd baby to avoid losing her child. So we talk about the harms of criminalizing or state surveillance in healthcare settings, and this is exactly why. So she had a home birth. She passed out. The baby was unresponsive when she woke up. She's been charged with murder. The San Diego DA has really not. We've tried to approach them behind the scenes. We've tried to convey all the things why this is not the right use of your resources. They don't really care. And they also think that the law that was amended in California that I mentioned earlier doesn't apply here, despite the fact that the law says that your pregnancy decisions and your pregnancy behavior, so like pre-birth conduct, cannot be a factor in any sort of criminal case for a post-birth outcome. So when did she decide to have a home birth? When she was pregnant. When did she prepare for her home birth? When she was pregnant. And then the idea that she can then be criminalized for not acting exactly the way that a judge thinks one should act in the immediate aftermath of having a baby at home by yourself, laboring alone, and then charging someone with murder that is the standard is with malice, is remarkable, and we think entirely wrong. But I think people are starting to sort of, this is a total tangent, but I think people are starting to get the connections and get the idea that if we are going to criminalize someone for the outcome of a pregnancy when they decided to have a home birth for reasons that I think a lot of us can understand, that has implications that reach beyond that one individual circumstances. And the idea that we are choosing to police people in these crisis moments is, I think, that this is just something that you know, as someone who has given birth, as someone, as other, you know, other people who have had their own reproductive health decisions and difficult moments in their lives, you start to understand just how harmful and how traumatizing and truly like the generational impact of these kinds of prosecutions can have. I mean, we work with mothers who are facing criminal charges and they can't see their kids, and their newborns are being taken away from them before they ever have a chance to breastfeed or hold them, you know, and this is not just and then the grandparents have to step in to take care of the child in the best of circumstances. So we're talking about generational harm that's happening. So I think that the attention around this, I think, is good. The other piece of it is that we're hearing about a lot more cases. So I can't yet tell you for certain that there are more cases. We certainly know about more cases now. Perhaps because there's more of a spotlight. There are some really good reporters out there who have just made it their beat. They literally send us cases. They have amazing Google alerts. I don't know what their algorithms they're using, but they're sending us cases that we aren't finding. So we're getting cases all the time. And I, you know, when we look at our data, that we are trending upward. So our data shows that we published a study about 10 years ago. For over 413 cases we recorded from 1973 to 2005. So that's over a 32-year period. In this next data set from 2006 through Dobbs, we're upwards of 1,500 cases. So that is, I can't do the math that quick, more than three times as many cases in less than half the time period. So the trend is going up. And I think we continue to sort of see that. And I think if we were to look by year or by every couple year period, the closer in time to now, you would see that the line gets steeper. So it's happening at a faster clip. The hotspots are growing. We don't have enough staff to cover all the hotspots we're seeing, but so it is a double-edged sword, I suppose, because the attention is really good. People are angry about these cases now. And I also think that other organizations and other advocates have done a really good job. Drug Policy Alliance, for one, other organizations that have really started, we are having conversations about regulating marijuana, decriminalizing drugs. We're looking back at the war on drugs and the harms that has caused. And it's, you know, criminal justice reform. I know there's been a lot of stops and starts on that, but people are revisiting all of these things, except for pregnant people. You know, like we're seeing even in states like Oklahoma, for example, they legalized medical marijuana, but pregnant people are being charged with felonies for using prescribed medical marijuana in pregnancy that they got with a card like everyone else. There's no exception for pregnant people in the law. You know, it's regulated for them like everyone else, and yet they're still being charged with child endangerment felonies. So we're seeing progress, and we're seeing more people understand the interconnectedness of these issues, and we're seeing progress on drug reform and other things. But we are also seeing more cases. So I don't know what conclusions you could draw from that, but yeah.
No, it's just incredible. Can we go back to the Carpenter case for a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
So, you know, as you describe her thought process of the experience with her two older children, knowing that she was still using drugs that would likely put her into jeopardy of losing a third child, it strikes me as very reasonable that she would do what she did, even though it didn't have the outcome she was planning on it. And it does trigger that thing we talk about in law school all the time, which is, what is a reasonable person?
Right.
So I want to invite Kate, who wrote about this for today, and particularly on this issue, to sort of jump in here with some thoughts.
Yeah, I wrote my paper about specifically based on the case, the Bonte case, which is in the readings, the pregnancy justice readings you sent over, where a pregnant person was sued by their fetus for negligently crossing the street. And so that got me thinking about like the reasonable person standard, and I dug into that a little bit and problems with the reasonable person standard, and then looked at the like reasonable woman standard that some people propose, which also comes with its own problems. But basically what I ended up concluding after looking at those is that pregnant people are held to an even higher reasonableness standard, that basically if they do anything that does any harm to their fetus, they're not being reasonable. And that leads to a whole bunch of potentially ridiculous cases that could happen. So yeah, I would be curious to hear more about ways that you've seen in your work pregnant people being held to these sort of ridiculously high standards where they can't seem to do anything that would hurt their fetus in any way.
Yeah, that's it's so true. What I think is also going on here, well, there's a few things. There's the phenomenon of like an idealized, antiquated view of like motherhood. Who is deserving of being a mother? What families are deserving of being kept together? You don't, if you do certain things, you don't deserve a healthy birth outcome. You don't deserve custody of your kid. You don't, so there's that. And just like deep stigma around substance use still, particularly for pregnant folks, particularly for certain communities. The other thing that has just been so remarkable to me, and I'm not sure why, because it shouldn't be surprising, but there is like the actors in these systems don't understand how pregnancy works. Like 15 to 20% of the pregnancies end in pregnancy loss, miscarriage, or stillbirth. Like that is across all people and races and all the things. And environmental factors like access to healthy food and clean air and regular medical care, even before you get pregnant, all those things have much greater impacts on your ability to have a healthy pregnancy than, exposure to substances, whether it's prescribed or not during your pregnancy. And then this idea, and this has actually come up, this is sort of a new trend we're seeing around that post-birth period. Like, how do you behave after you give birth? Alone, unattended. We have another case that we've been working on recently out of Pennsylvania where a young woman gave birth at 23 weeks, preterm birth. She allegedly waited an hour before showing up at the ER. They charged her with third-degree murder. We got the murder charge dropped. There's allegations of substance use there as well, but they're still charging her with felony child endangerment because she has allegedly waited an hour after giving birth at home. She was 20 years old at 23 weeks. And we're like, does anyone have any idea of like what it's like to give birth and like what by yourself without medicate? Like, I mean, and the idea that like waiting up to an hour could be a felony. Like and so I've come to realize like very basic information that experts can provide. Like it doesn't even have to be like someone in academia. It could be a practicing OB who can say, you lose X amount of blood. You are not thinking straight. You might call your parent first. You might call a friend first, and also the systems that are implicated when you call 911, often the police show up. And if you have ever had like all of the things that how deeply connected our police and our medical systems and our child welfare systems are. So I think that there's just a lack of recognition of like the lived experience of people who have given birth in the decision making around these cases and the people who have power in these cases. And also this idea of like, I think that we can to make this relatable, I guess, to think about like, if a fetus is a child and you could charge someone with child endangerment, or exposing a fetus to some perceived risk of harm. That theoretically could mean, playing sports or working a physical job or, not following your doctor's advice around bed rest. I mean, we actually have had those cases around bed rest, but, so the slippery slope is real. But I also don't want us to come up with sort of those examples, those hypotheticals as a way to make this more palatable, because I think that to like Lynn's reason for founding the organization, for all of the work that she did, was that these are the cases that we need to not be ashamed. Like there's been enough shame and stigma around it that we need to be, strong advocates for the folks that we, that we're in these cases that we're seeing.
So in sort of response to Kate's quandary, rather than trying to come up with a gendered standard of care, it sounds to me like maybe just starting with the basic science, having a reasonable person who understood something about pregnancy,
right,
would be a huge step in the right direction
Yeah,
in these
yeah,
cases.
yeah.
How, I mean, these cases are so politicized now, they always have been, and you get, I don't know, the prosecutor in the Carpenter case, other than reading the materials that you gave us. Um, but I do know in a lot of the cases that you all have, these are people running for election, they're prosecuting, the prosecutions are very politicized events where they are pandering to a particular
Mhm.
electorate,
Mhm.
that is very anti-choice and more than happy to stigmatize the community of people you're representing. So what have you found have been the better interventions to have some kind of check on the way in which irrational politics ends up driving such precarity for people who are already in a pretty tough spot as it is? I mean, losing your kid is
Yeah,
horrible
yeah,
to begin with.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've had some luck. So we have had some positive developments in a pair of other California cases over the last couple of years in a place in the Central Valley in California, which is politically very conservative. A prosecutor, a single prosecutor, same hospital, same facts, two women, Adora Perez and Chelsea Becker. They both gave birth to babies that were born still. They were stillbirths. They both tested positive for meth. They both were charged with feticide. In California, this is the law that was just recently clarified. In California, feticide, 38 states have feticide laws. This is a law that was passed theoretically with the idea that you could be charged for a crime for attacking a pregnant person and causing fetal loss. So you essentially enshrines a fetus as a separate and unique victim of a crime. I think it was an insidious way of normalizing fetal personhood, but these laws are often passed out in the wake of a horrific attack on a pregnant person, and a prosecutor throwing up their hands and saying, like, yes, we know that this 8 months pregnant person died and their fetus died, but we can only charge for the loss of the pregnant person. The law doesn't recognize the loss of the fetus. So then, the legislature convenes and they pass a law like this. So despite the fact that the California law was never intended to apply to the pregnant person themselves, both Chelsea and Adora were charged with feticide. Adora pled to the non-existent crime of manslaughter of a fetus and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Chelsea spent 20 months in jail waiting trial. Both of them are now out. We got Adora's plea. We overturned. Essentially, it was an unconstitutional plea. And Chelsea, we were able to fight the charges. But that DA lost his primary reelection. He was a Republican, very conservative. Another Republican, a woman, made this one of her campaign issues and said, I will not chart. This is ridiculous. This is not what the law was intended to do. I'm not going to apply the law in this way. She attended a rally in support of the women, and she beat him. And so we don't have to worry about King County, California for a little while. So that's something, and those stories were in the headlines for a while. And the fact that there were two of them and and again, it was a advocacy, comm strategy, narrative storytelling, humanizing folks. You have to obviously do it with a lot of care and a lot of intention, but that was something that we were able to move the needle on. Another case, a series of cases out of Etowah County, Alabama, which is very conservative, where you come out. We had an attorney helping us from Birmingham, and he might as well have been from New York City. Like, it was just as not local as we were when he was coming from the big city and us. But we have local folks now. But we had a lot of media attention on what was going on there. They were essentially detaining pregnant one postpartum folks on charges indefinitely. There was like an unconstitutional bond policy. And while we weren't able to challenge the law itself, because the law is just really bad there, we were able to shed a lot of light on what was going on, and that 12 pregnant or postpartum folks were being held in this local jail at any given time. We got the bond policy changed. We got them all out. And they were a little sheepish about what was happening there, but no one had called attention to it. We just kind of stumbled upon it when we got an intake and learned what was happening. And so we are able to, I I think when you talk about it as a matter of resources, like, do you really want your local DA's office using their resources, your taxpayer money to do this? You know, like, is there nothing else they could be doing? I mean, not that we want them to be charging other people with other crimes, like, but, you know, people need to know what's happening in their own communities. And often these are the kinds of things that are just happening and no one pays attention to. You know, another component of this is that in that county and in a lot of places where we work, there's no public defender office. So these are court appointed attorneys that are being paid very little to take these cases on. It's like they're overburdened, they're under-resourced. Public defenders have offices, they have professional development, they have training, they have support, they have budgets for experts. These local appointed attorneys are at a real disadvantage, even the ones with the best of intentions. And so these cases are happening and there's just no one paying attention. We have been able to politicize it in our own way a little bit, but we also have to be careful because if we do it the wrong way, they'll be like, yeah, we're glad that New York City based organization is pissed. Like, that's exactly what we want. So we have to be really thoughtful about the way we go about that.
Well, that was actually the nature of my next question, which is that to talk a little bit about both the tactics and the strategies that you use to not be the New York City lawyers coming down to Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia or wherever. Is a lot of the work kind of behind the scenes, consulting with local counsel? Do you have no fingerprints on stuff often for that reason?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. We try to find really good local attorneys who know the court clerk and know the judges and and our friend went to, you know, law school with the DA and can kind of move behind the scene, or even they can move behind the scenes. We're even further behind the scenes, but we are often completely in the background and you would never know that we're involved. And we're just a level of resources around experts, sometimes around amicus briefs. Sometimes we're just writing all the briefs because these are attorneys who are in court all day and they don't write briefs. And so strategizing, thinking about ways to tell the story, to shift the narrative. Most of the press around these cases is so stigmatizing. It's like, mom gives birth to drug addicted baby or fourth drug addicted baby or something like that. Or like they call a 14-week or 16-week fetus a baby. You know, it's like all of that. So oftentimes the people charged are interested in having a different story told about them. They don't want the only picture of them out when you Google them, their mugshot. They want pictures with their kids or, you know, so we help sometimes on the behind the scenes to help with that and think about strategy in that way. Another thing is finding credible messengers. So we're working on some legislation in Alabama right now, and the leaders on the bill is the American Academy of Pediatrics Alabama. So the idea that we have the pediatricians working on this is pretty amazing, and March of Dimes. And we are so far away. We are far away from that. And often thinking about who the credible messengers are. In Oklahoma, where another place where we've had a lot of cases, we had over 30 doctors sign an open letter condemning 2 local DAs around their criminal charges of pregnant people. And you're making it hard. Oh, thanks. You're making it hard for us to care for our patients. We can't care for our patients if they believe that they are going to be charged with crimes because they have substance use disorder or, you know, so having a bunch of Oklahoma-based doctors from credible institutions like the local big universities, those are the messengers that we need. And they're the ones who can really shift public opinion and maybe even convince some DAs that what they're doing is not useful.
So when we talk about the Carpenter case, it reminds me of a lot of the earlier cases that you also had. Was it Bebe Shui? Was that her name? Who did a self-induced abortion?
No, that was Purvi Patel.
Maybe it was Purvi
Yeah.
Patel. There's so many, unfortunately. I think she took a substance, had a miscarriage, prosecuted for feticide or something like that. I imagine we're going to see a lot more of those cases. They're very similar to the Carpenter case of people given the environment they're in, taking their own healthcare into their own hands.
Yeah.
And doing things that to some people look like irrational, if not felonious, kinds of behavior. And I'm wondering if you're seeing an uptick in those kinds of cases.
Yeah, there's been a few that have come in or that we've learned of for self-managing abortions. And I think that we will still, I think it's still a little too early to really know the full scope. But I think we'll see. So we've always had, there's always been a few cases. It's not, of the close to 2,000 that we've seen, it's a few dozen of that group. So it's not the vast majority of the cases that we've seen historically are people who go on to give birth to babies who are pretty much healthy. After that, it's the pregnancy loss cases, the stillbirth and miscarriage cases. And then the third category would be the self-managed abortion cases. There's only a couple states that actually criminalize self-managed abortion explicitly. But we know, given all the cases that we've worked on, that you don't need a criminal abortion law to prosecute pregnancy. Like that's just clear, right? Like you can use child abuse, child neglect, delivery of drugs to a minor via the umbilical cord, feticide, murder, manslaughter. So we will see more cases like this because for two reasons that are, I think, obvious to everyone. More people will self-manage using pills from overseas pharmacies or other states, or they'll, travel to get them and then return home. And we'll see, and because abortion is now criminalized in so many places, there are prosecutors who will feel more empowered to charge these kinds of cases. And Mary Ziegler, a scholar who at California, in Florida, she wrote an article last year about before the Dobbs decision that I always return to, which is, if prosecutors want to prosecute around abortion, they're not going to go after the doctors. They're going to go after the patients. It's just a lot easier. The patients, the people who are self-managing are going to be in their jurisdiction. They're not going to be reaching out into other states or the pharmacies that are dispensing them or the telehealth companies. They're going to, if they, I don't know that they are necessarily using their resources right now to surveil folks, but if a case falls in their lap, they're going to, prosecutors are going to prosecute. And those are the kinds of things that we worry about a lot. And people were very laser focused on things like period tracking apps and things like that. And I think that's like a complete red herring. It's the usual stuff. When people get arrested, the cops will take your phone or ask you to turn over your phone voluntarily because it's a lot quicker that way. And then they'll swipe all the data from your phone and then they'll see who you're texting and they'll see what websites you visited or places you went. It's the very basic stuff that gets a lot of folks in trouble, because of just our normal criminal surveillance and digital footprint stuff. That's what happened in Purvi Patel's case. It was her text messages to a friend. It was an online purchase of abortion pills, and she was charged with feticide and convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. That conviction was overturned. She ended up spending like 3 years in prison, but still, and that was like 2015. That's the kind of thing. It's like not the it's not the the reverse search engine warrant thing where like they're just going to try to get everyone who Googled, abortion pills in a certain zip code. I think it's going to be someone is pulled over because they have an outstanding warrant on something else. And in the normal police stuff that happens, they get information about something else. And that's where I feel like we're going to see more stuff. And that also goes to which communities are surveilled, which communities are policed, which communities are vulnerable to this kind of thing. And it's, it's the communities of color, poor folks. It's the same stuff.
Right. So you were telling us about California being proactive and creating a safe harbor, a kind of sanctuary for pregnant people. And New York is trying to do the same thing. Other states are too, but I know California and New York are in the lead. Have we done the same thing that California did about declaring that you can't be prosecuted for pregnancy-related crimes? So we still have that on the to-do list?
Yeah, I mean, I think it wouldn't hurt, but I think it was particularly a priority in California for this last package of proactive bills because of the two cases, Adora and Chelsea, that just were, the AG got involved. It was a big deal. And, some folks were kind of like, the law is already clear. So we have to be very clear that we're not creating new protections. We're clarifying existing law. So I don't know that it would hurt in New York. I feel like there's maybe a slight less sense of urgency on that, although we've had cases in New York, and not that long ago either, of people facing criminal charges around their pregnancies.
Right. So there are a number of us who have found it compelling to draw an analogy between the period we're in now, where different states are regulating abortion in different ways, and some are basically free states around reproductive rights or justice, and others are absolutely not. And the analogy to the Fugitive Slave Act and the ways in which northern states, some of them, affirmatively tried to create safe havens for Black people seems quite compelling, which is what Trisha wrote about for today. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So first I just want to clarify that I think that abortion and slavery are like fundamentally incomparable, and that when you engage in too close of a comparison, it's like offensive, and also it's the same tactic that anti-abortion activists use. So you don't want to do that too closely or adamantly. But yeah, I did write my paper comparing these laws that aim to criminalize or impose civil liabilities for out-of-state abortions to the Fugitive Slave Act. I mean, obviously the big like difference being, amongst other differences, is that, that was a federal act and these are state laws. But I talked about how I focus on two one amendment and then one bill that's actually probably about to get passed in Idaho by the governor. It's like, going to go to the desk of the governor. And it allows for private citizens to sue the abortion providers, and then also in other states who provide abortions to residents from the state where abortion's legal, and then also people who quote unquote like aid and abet it. So that includes people who provide the transportation, people who like, if you text your friend, where should I get an abortion? And the person responds, like that could be, you could be held civilly liable for that. And like that you can get damages. Like one of them, I can't remember, I think it might've been Idaho, like you can get like $20,000 in damages or something like that. And then I talked about with the Fugitive Slave Act, how people were first of all, they're punished for concealing or assisting slaves who had run away. And then also people were financially incentivized to report slaves that they thought were fugitive, that you could get $5 if you like captured what you thought was a fugitive slave. So I talked about how these mechanisms of like you get money for reporting people that they encourage, like basically being like a vigilante and spying on people and apprehending people, and that's how that's like a parallel. Yeah.
Raise your voice at the end of something, of a sentence, to make it sound like a question.
And then I also, but then I talked about like the fundamental differences other than just like the stakes involved behind holding someone liable for financially liable for providing abortion versus like punishing someone for saving someone from human captivity, essentially. The stakes are obviously different. Another difference is that with the fugitive slave laws were based upon the premise of dehumanizing, versus these laws are based upon personifying the fetus. So I guess the question I have is that with these bills that allow private citizens, or potential bills that allow private citizens to sue the abortion providers and then also those who aid and abet, but they explicitly say that you can't sue the person who gets an abortion. Do you know why that is? Like why they would only want to, I mean, I'm sure it's not because they're being altruistic. Like I think that there's something that they're trying to get around, and I couldn't really figure out what that might be.
Yeah, I mean, my suspicion is that, well, there's, first of all, I think there's still a notion, although I think it's shifting, that people who get abortions are victims. And so they're just like, they're infantilizing the abortion seeker. And so it's like they were swept up in this thing that their helpers or their, family or their partner wanted for them. And so they're the victim. They're, and the abortion industrial complex has preyed upon them. And so they're not full thinking people. So I think that's part of it. And I also think that it's a PR strategy. Historically, the anti-abortion movement has said, like, we never want to jail, anyone or criminalize anyone, and the abortion seeker. We're only regulating or criminalizing the abortion provider, because again, it was like they are predatory abortionists. That was what they used to be called. They are predatory abortionists who are going after women who aren't thinking straight, because people who can become pregnant are crazy if they don't actually want to fulfill the ultimate whatever of becoming a mother. That is our destiny.
Remember
And
that
so,
language in Carhartt. That,
yes,
right, that
yeah.
women actually are not making rational decisions and come to regret the decision.
Yes,
they
abortion regret. Yeah.
And that's why we need the state in there helping.
Because we all are supposed to be mothers. And if we don't conform to that, then something is wrong. And so truly, that's like the narrative for a long time. I think that's shifting. And and then there's this abortion abolitionist, speaking of like co-opting, that era, of when we enslaved people. There's this movement in the faction of the anti-abortion movement that talks about abortion abolition, which is essentially, if abortion is murder, then the people who get abortions are murderers, of course. Like, how can it not be? If a fetus is a child, you are killing a child, you are a murderer, full stop, no exceptions. And so we need to start prosecuting pregnant people for murder. And if you think of anything less, then you are not, it's really just, PR. And so that is a faction of the movement right now. And I think that the most radical, I think what's interesting is like there is a splintering of the anti-abortion movement about how far to go. And some folks are saying that's too far, and others are saying like where we are now is not far enough, and we need to go to the abolitionist framework. I do think that, and the other piece of this most extreme mentality too is we know that, I mean, not to get like really, really dark, but we know that people will, yeah.
You're already there.
Sorry. We know that people will die. We know that probably people have already died, and we just don't know it because it hasn't hit the news in the way that, we would all find out. But when the person dies and there will be a martyr. And I think they are very worried. The anti-abortion movement is very worried about a martyr. That's what happened in Ireland. If you followed what happened in Ireland a few years ago, Savita was a woman who died. She had sepsis. They would not perform a life-saving abortion, and she died. And she really became the martyr, for better or for worse, that shifted the laws in Ireland pretty remarkably. They are getting ready, and they're getting their talking points ready for when the person dies, and that becomes the big news story and the thing that galvanizes everyone. And the talking points are starting to leak out, again, thanks to some really good reporting on this. And it's around like the most ultimate sacrifice a woman can make is to die in service of the life of their fetus. And like they are getting ready. Like that it will be the narrative that this was the ultimate gift. And that was that is our destiny. But that she sacrificed her life in the hope that this state, like whatever, it doesn't matter. Like none of this science, medicine, rational thinking, none of it matters. So that is going to be the narrative. And so I think that they have historically stayed away from criminalizing or penalizing out like in broad daylight the pregnant person. Whenever I get asked the question, like, this law exempts pregnant people from being criminalized. It's just the provider, it's whatever. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's, let's talk about fetal personhood laws, because fetal personhood laws have turned every law that criminalizes anything that has to do with a child or a person into a law that criminalizes pregnancy. And how many people have been charged with crime? And like, it's the pregnant person who's being charged. So it, the Susan B. Anthony group or whatever they're called, like the anti-abortion women group has said, like, we never want to go after the pregnant person. And my response is always like, you've already done it by normalizing fetal personhood and passing fetal personhood laws. You've done it. So, this is just this next step. Yeah. I think she had do you have a follow-up?
Oh, sorry, Trish, go ahead.
I just kind of thought about something that I wrote about in my paper that I sort of want to almost revisit, which is that I wrote about how another difference is that like the constitutional protections that will make a lot of these laws difficult to implement in practice. Like, for instance, there's like a theoretical constitutional right to travel versus constitutional protections in general were just not afforded to slaves or to Black people in general. But then I'm also thinking that they're probably going to try to, afford constitutional protection, like the argument that fetuses should have constitutional protections themselves. So it's like, there's really no winning.
Yeah. Well, I want to push a little bit more on this, the imaginary of the idealized mother. So one of the great things about this class is that we have people from all over the world, like right here, Sweden, India, Japan, Colombia, I could keep going, and Missouri. And Lainey wrote today really interestingly about her experience growing up in Missouri and the sense of community that there was around motherhood. It was really beautiful, I thought, what you wrote. And maybe you want to say a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much for being here. This week's readings were really interesting. And I think we all have somewhat of a personal connection to the idea of abortion and just the act of getting pregnant, being pregnant, going through birth is a traumatic idea. I have been struck many times by the decisions of the Supreme Court, as we all have probably. And a lot of times they feel like personal reflections of the people themselves, the justices themselves, more than like a coherent argument of legal theory. So yeah, and it's really interesting when you say like this sacrifice of divine motherhood. I wrote about that a little bit in my paper. I think divinity and God is a huge connection for this ideology. My fear is that the ball will never move forward in the courts when you have people who feel this way in power. So do you have any ideas like what pillars you're seeing the most movement in a positive way? And when this has such a cultural significance, people are holding on to this idea of divine motherhood so firmly, it's more important than any other idea. Like, how do you get that progress, and where does it come from, if not the courts?
That's
Deep.
It's deep. It's a lot to think about. My hope, and I have to be hopeful, is that we are in the last gasps of white supremacy and patriarchy and transphobia and all of the things where we're seeing such deep backlash, because you only see deep backlash when you've made progress. And so I truly think that this is like my pitch to you all, this is a voting rights and democracy issue. We are in the majority. The folks who support abortion rights are in the majority. We live in a majoritarian government, society, whatever. And so we have to work within this system, at least right now, to shift the balance of power. And I do think that in 10, 15 years, we will have federal abortion protections that are better than Roe. Like, I do think that is possible. I do think that is a world we need to imagine. And I think we can get there. And I think we will have to go down. I did a talk last week at a New Jersey college, and we called it the shame spiral. We have to go deeper down into the shame spiral of the trauma and the harm that this will cause before we will be able to pull ourselves out. Like, I do think we will see the deaths. I do think we will see doctors potentially be charged with crimes. We will see more pregnant people be, I think we will see some really bad stuff before it gets better, but I do think we will get there. And I think that this is a response to shifting population. We're going to be a non-white majority country soon. There is a lot of fear. I think if we really dig in here, this is about like domestic supply of white infants. Like that's what this is about. This is about controlling the reproduction of white people and letting everyone else die or be jailed. This is about women making decisions, having fewer babies than we ever have in this country. We are, trending in many countries. We're trending below replacement, not yet in the US because of a lot of reasons. But so I think that this is a reaction to all of that. And if we have, I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that with a generational shift, with the deep support for abortion rights and just, I've been doing this work, I don't know, like I'm not like an elder yet, or maybe I'm maybe in the middle, but I was at the March for Women's Lives in 2004. I was in college, and it was like, I was like, we're going to lose Roe. It's going to happen. Bush is our president. It's going to happen. And everyone's like, yeah. Like we could not get anyone to believe us. And it was like the same, maybe our vision was too narrow. Clearly Roe was never enough. We were very much focused on abortion only. We're not thinking about all the, not thinking with a reproductive justice framework for sure. So, we're here now, and it's going to take us a while to climb back out. But I think that this is shedding light on things that have been bad. And abortion has been inaccessible for a very, very long time for a lot of people. And we're now just starting to understand how bad it is and how bad it's been. And I think we'll be able to climb our way out of it. I have to be hopeful.
That is a ray of hope. I've got one question. I've got 20 questions. I'm going to open it up, particularly those of you who are on call today, Abby, Jen, and Austin, and others. Please get your questions ready. You and I were working, when you were at the commission, we were working together on this issue of social holds. You got me interested in this. And you were doing a report, an investigation of private hospitals, not the public hospitals, and asked us and some of the students I was working with to look at public hospital policies where infants were being held and not released with the birth parent when the birth parent was being released. Because the hospital, and we talked a little bit to Joyce McMillan about this the other day, the hospital illegally kind of stepped into the role of ACS and triggered a kind of review of the parents' fitness to take that infant home, often for reasons like they have other children in the foster care system, not that they'd actually tested positive for drugs or anything like that. So I want you to say a little bit more about that work. Where did it go?
Yeah.
What's up with that?
Yeah. I mean, Joyce is a force. So I don't want to, I will
notice that when you were there.
It's a true honor to work in coalition with her. And she has moved the needle in ways that I think no one imagined. So I was in city government for 6 years, and, it only takes a few people in city government to really move stuff. There's inertia in government, meaning that systems are slow, there's bureaucracy. But if you've got someone like my commissioner was Carmela Morales, who's a mentor of mine at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. And she was like, we're just going to do stuff and apologize later if it's outside of our authority, or we'll pass some regulations later to clean it up. But we're just going to take these positions and do what we can while we can. And that was amazing. And we were able to get some stuff done that was really unusual. So we had this mandate to investigate whatever we wanted, basically, as long as it wasn't another city agency. That was the limit, which is a huge carve out. But we were, because of some, again, reporting. So real reporting is really important, really devastating articles that were called the New Jane Crow. And it was around, and I'm sure Joyce talked a lot about this, and maybe even Rhea. I know the Women's Rights Project is looking at this stuff too. The way in which the family regulation system targets families of color and really just destroys lives. And part of the way that we got into this is we were thinking about, okay, like we can't open an investigation against ACS. They're another agency within the city government. We're restricted from doing that. But what can we do from where we sit as the enforcer of the anti-discrimination law? That covers employment, housing, and public accommodations. Public accommodations are basically anything that provides goods and services. So we're like, okay, let's investigate hospitals in New York City and who they drug test. If they disproportionately drug test communities of color, which we suspected they were, and everything we heard was that they were, then we can we can fine them, we can shame them, we can litigate against them. But really our goal was to like get information before we could, even needed to litigate, demand that they come to the table and like reform their practices. So we opened an investigation. It took a long time to get this off the ground, but we opened an investigation to 3 different hospital entities. So they had locations throughout the city. And the important part is in anti-discrimination law, you really need comparators. So if you're a hospital that serves a predominantly, let's say, Latinx community, it's really hard to show that you're only drug testing. If you're drug testing everyone and the patient population is 98% one national origin or race, you're not really showing discrimination. You're showing bad stuff, but it's not discrimination. So we needed to figure out a way to, within a single entity, show that there was disparate treatment happening. And so we looked at Mount Sinai, Montefiore, and one other that I can't remember now. And because they had locations in different boroughs with different patient populations, if the location, at Columbus Circle was not drug testing their patients, but the location in, Morningside Heights or Harlem or the Bronx, South Bronx was, then we could make an argument. So I left, that was a year before I left city government. We worked with a ton of community-based organizations, many of which I'm in coalition now, to get that off the ground. The investigation is still ongoing. It's been 3 years. I have heard murmurs that they're getting close to announcing a resolution. Government moves slowly, especially when my commissioner is no longer the commissioner. This was like a real passion of hers, and she's no longer there. So that's the status. But it was we thought it was a really creative way of getting at this sort of entrenched issue through the lens of government oversight.
And the consolidation of ownership of hospitals actually helped, so that you'd have the same company in more affluent neighborhoods
exactly.
and less affluent neighborhoods. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got more, but other questions. Jen.
Hello. I'm really interested in your discussion around the importance of science in this area and overcoming illegitimate science and the important role that doctors play as well. Can I ask you practically how you get those doctors on board? Who's interested in doing this work? Do they get paid to do this work? Where do you get the funding for it? All that kind of thing.
Those are great questions and things that we kind of learn as we go. We have a tendency to over rely on like a handful of our trusted partners who are in like academic settings where they don't need to be paid for their time in the same way, which of course means that it's a very sort of privileged group of experts.
I actually do this for free, just so you know, because I just love you all. So I don't
Right. Academia provides some level of flexibility. But there have been moments where we really need a local, like it was not going to help to have like a Yale, MD, PhD come in. And so it takes just a lot of work and a lot of showing up and a lot of like building credibility. And even in the most politically conservative places, there is usually a really great public academic institution. Like I'm thinking we have great partners at University of Alabama, Birmingham, and they will step in. Even they will be outsiders, but it's better than, someone coming from the Northeast. We sometimes pay them. They will sometimes do things like on a reduced rate. We also work with partner organizations, and we split the fees sometimes. In a case we're working on right now in Ohio, the time of the expert is paid for by the public defender. They have gotten funds from the court that's funded for their time, but their travel is not. So like we cobbled together like through 3 different organizations. Okay, we'll each take a third of their travel and accommodations, and like that, we're just scraping stuff together as we go. But I do think that in a rush, sometimes we need an expert to submit an affidavit with 3 days notice. So I'm literally texting someone who I know, who I met at a conference, and I'm like, can you do, and we draft it and they sign it and they edit it. But like, it is really, there is no like formal, at least we don't have a really formal way of doing it. But oftentimes, we can often start, if we're looking for state-based folks, you can find really good folks at those like larger institutions. And they're often like, I don't mean to sound like, I don't like paternalistic in any way, but like those institutions hold even in other parts of the state, they hold a lot of credibility. It's like University of Alabama is one of the largest employers in the state, and there's a lot of pride, and people take a lot of pride in those institutions and how well regarded they are. And so if you can get an expert from like, Oklahoma State University or University of Alabama or Ohio State, like that means a lot. And so we usually if we don't have anyone, we'll usually start there. And like the local ACOG, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the local chapter, medical students for choice oftentimes there's an alumni network, like if we need an OB. So yeah, different tactics like that. But it is, if you peek behind the curtain, we're like holding stuff together with like, Scotch tape and like a Google Doc. Like it's, we're
Austin?
Yeah, I kind of I'm gonna have like 2 questions regarding prosecution and prosecutors. And the first is, I know earlier you mentioned counties can have different numbers of charges depending on who the prosecutor is, and that a lot of times with the charges that are brought, it's like they don't really understand how pregnancy works. And I'm wondering if you've observed a difference in how women and male prosecutors go about making these types of charges, and if gender matters at all, if we'd be better off if there were more women prosecutors. And secondly, I know within social justice circles, becoming a prosecutor or being a prosecutor is kind of stigmatized, right? Like it's not really the best role that you can be in, but they do wield a lot of power. So I'm wondering if it's somewhat antithetical to want to become a prosecutor and pursue justice, or if you think that the people that want to do this work and do good may benefit from being in those roles of power and bringing certain cases or declining to.
Wow, that's a really good question. I'll start with the first, which I don't know that I could say with any certainty that a female prosecutor takes a different approach. In Kelsey Carpenter's case, it's a woman prosecutor, just as an anecdote. There are more men in these roles than women generally. So yeah, I just don't know. I think a diversity of experience and background benefits all of us. But I also know there's a lot of like, especially like white women upholding like really awful things in this country and are sort of like the more maybe palatable or gentle face to really horrific stuff. So I don't know that it's that I could really point to a difference in how these things go. But And I think it could go both ways. For people who have experienced pregnancy and any of the outcomes that might come with pregnancy, I think it changes you. And I think it's a experience like no other. And so if you are someone who has had that experience and have had the privilege of not being separated from your newborn or not losing a pregnancy, and then you're going on to prosecute people, like I think that maybe it does change you in a way that might make you change your feelings about this. And I think that I certainly think that people who have not experienced any of that and who or are willfully ignorant to those things are misunderstand or choose to ignore those realities. So On your second question, oh, sorry.
Wouldn't it be cool if we said that having been pregnant was a BFOQ for being a prosecutor?
If you're going to prosecute these cases. Yeah.
Yeah.
On your second question, we as an organization have we describe we work within this system, this criminal legal system. And at the same time, like we try to think towards like what it would look like without a criminal legal system. Imagine what that could be. I think that I've worked with organizations like Fair and Just Prosecution, where they're building a bench of progressive prosecutors who are looking at, who certainly will not prosecute these kinds of cases, and are looking at not prosecuting any sort of like drug use, pregnancy, family separation type stuff. And that's great. And we don't have to worry about those places, and we have relationships and they're open to learning from us and hearing from us. And, so and I worked in city government, not in a prosecutorial role, but you can make a big difference from those positions of power. And I think that there is a lot to be said about if you can wield power to make change and not sort of be part of the system then I think it could be really transformative. But we also like our abolitionists, so we don't believe in it in the first place. So it's like, I'm just trying to grapple with the duality of that. Like, it is the system we have, and it's not going to be abolished anytime soon. So it would probably be a less harmful system if we had people who had power, who, went after folks for wage theft rather than, and got people's wages back, which is like the most common crime, rather than going after folks who use drugs. So I don't know. That's sort of a non-answer, but.
Abigail? Abby?
Hi, thanks for being here. Hello. Yeah. I have sort of a similar question, and I thought the readings were really interesting as well, and sort of highlighted the incredible cruelty I think it often takes to prosecute somebody in what is the worst moment of their life, but also the cruelty in the way that the cases are actually prosecuted, like the characterization of putting a baby on your chest, or feeding or clothing the baby is malice instead of immediately calling 911, or the case you were talking about waiting an hour. But they have had these sort of successful conversations highlighting that cruelty, it sounds like, to some prosecutors. So I'm curious, like, what the conditions are, where you're able to make those arguments most effectively, and why you think that is. And in cases where you aren't able to, maybe what's motivating that kind of cruelty. And then my second question, I feel like we've talked a lot about sort of state intervention that's really, really harmful, but I'm curious if from your organization's perspective, there are sort of systems that we could put in place for pregnant people who do want support with substance abuse or things like that during their pregnancy, and if your organization is also kind of working on that as part of your agenda.
So I think our most successful interventions with prosecutors has been about the science. It's not be less cruel, be less harmful. It's twofold. One is there's a fantastic study, and actually this is a pitch for all of you, because normally we look at peer-reviewed journals and medical journals and things, but there's a law review article called State-Created Fetal Harm by two law professors, one's at Wake Forest now and one's at University of Alabama, Birmingham, where they analyzed, so Tennessee passed a law, the only law in the country, called the Fetal Assault Law, that was targeted at pregnant people. It was only in effect for 2 years, from 2014 to 2016. And so they actually analyzed health outcomes before the law, during the law, and after the law, and controlling for all this other stuff. And I don't understand it. One of the law professors who wrote it has a PhD in mathematics too, so he was able to do this. But controlling for all these other factors, they essentially said that the law caused like an increase by 60 of infant deaths in the state. And you can be assured that we use that stat every time we can when states are trying to pass laws that would explicitly criminalize a pregnant person. We're like, you care about babies? This is what will happen. More babies will die. Like, really. So one is that separating mothers from their newborns and criminalizing people will dissuade them from getting care, and that will worsen outcomes in your state. And by the way, you were already number 47 out of 50 for like maternal health. Sometimes that works, often they don't really care. The other piece is the science. So we're going to make it really, really hard for you to prove that meth caused this, that you could deliver drugs to a newborn via the umbilical cord in the moments in between birth and when you cut the umbilical cord, which was a theory by a Wyoming prosecutor. And our expert told the prosecutor, if you put up an expert that says that that's true, I will call their licensing board and file a complaint because it's a lie. And so he couldn't find an expert. He went as far as Colorado to try and find an expert. He couldn't find one, so he dropped the charges. So we usually rely on science, which I know is not great because, you know, there is some studies that show that cocaine use causes vasoconstriction, which could increase the risk of XYZ. Does that mean you should criminalize it? No, of course not. But like, we don't, you know, heavily relying on the science has its limitations. But that's been our best approach. And it's also like, we're going to make this really hard and you might be embarrassed. On your second question, there are really great providers of care who are OBs who specialize in substance use treatment. And we do not promote them because many of them are operating in places where, like, talk about people like not complying with, you know, in this moment in time, not complying with unjust laws and still helping people get the care that they need. There are providers in places that are providing care to substance using pregnant folks who they could, I suppose, call the police, call child welfare, and they're not. And so those are the kinds of places we will refer people to get care. They're often in the big city. Even if it's in a conservative place, it's usually in a big city in a conservative place. They are getting increased funding from philanthropy to do this work. And we're sort of promoting it as an alternative. There's more and more programs. And there are also programs around, like, you know, babies can stay with their mothers in substance use treatment places, like once the babies are born. It is so hard to imagine a world in which no family surveillance, no criminal legal implications when you get care. We're not there yet. So it's also hard for us to say, like, this system that is created by the government or funded by the government, where you are forced into, like, it's your option is either jail or substance use treatment, but you can keep your baby. Like, that's not the answer either, but that's sort of a place that I think some governments and some resources are being put in that kind of thing, or in that area. It's not ideal, but it is, I think, something that we are like quietly supporting as a way to avoid criminalization, even if it is not, it's a really sort of, it's being forced upon someone, and it's not something that they're choosing necessarily, but they're out there, and they're really great providers doing really great work, but they're doing it kind of under the radar.
Laura.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about the New York case, but also like this factor of law, whenever you criminalize something, impacts behavior way beyond the small number of cases that are prosecuted. Like, in my own experience at New York City hospitals, like, the birth training is pretty combative, and like, it's almost like held as a threat, like this criminalization, just like the hospital training of like, you're going to give birth in a hospital. And then also, like, I know, for example, the standard of care, they don't provide, like, many hospitals provide morphine or nitrous oxide as part of like pain management, and they systematically don't do that. And I wonder if that's to like detect opioids after pregnancy and like have the ability to be like, you're positive for opioids, specifically for this kind of catching you system.
So you asked about the New York case. Is it the case that when I mentioned to Professor Franke about like that we've had cases in New York?
Like,
yeah.
Specifically, like, that is my experience in New York, but also like, it seems like it has like these like threats of criminalization have changed how like medical providers
Yes.
and like everyone you interact with along the line, it acts because
Yeah. Yes, I think you're totally right. there is this idea that you must comply. I think there's also, we have fewer of these cases, but historically our organization also took cases where people refused medical care. They refused to provide consent to a cesarean or to, forced bed rest or other things. And then they were criminalized for that, or the hospital would try to get a court order to do that medical intervention that the person was refusing consent for. And it was always like you're putting your interests above your fetuses. And, people don't lose their right to bodily autonomy or the right to make informed decisions about their own. You could have cancer and decide, I don't want to be treated for cancer. That is your right. You could have an emergency situation and decide, I want to labor for longer. I don't want to be rushed into a cesarean. That is your right. You don't lose that right because you are pregnant, because there's a fetus. But that has been weaponized, and people have said, we're going to go to court and get a court order to force you into having a cesarean, or also like, your fetus will die and you'll be responsible. And that'll be, and then maybe not criminally, but you'll feel that guilt for the rest of your life. And then I think that there is a ton of recognition, I think, that patients who are seen as combative or patients who are seen as, not complying are disproportionately not privileged white people. And so the racial dynamics and the perception of people who are speaking up for themselves and who those folks are and not fitting in sort of this like compliant patient model are also, that's when the threats of I'm going to call CPS or I'm going to call, I think in New York, it's wielding the child welfare system entirely. Like we don't see in New York City, at least our organization hasn't seen the criminal system involved in the hospital setting as much, but the weaponizing and the threats around child welfare for sure. Your mention of not providing like nitrous oxide or morphine, I don't know for sure. Like we haven't seen that exact fact pattern, but we have, I kid you not, cases involving poppy seeds. Where people have consumed foods with poppy seeds, gone into labor, tested positive for opiates, and then had a child welfare action opened. And they're like, I literally have the receipt from Sam's Club with the salad with poppy seed dressing that I consumed 6 hours ago. Like, please retest me. Please, take me seriously. And that those cases have happened in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Illinois, so far of what we know. And so, that's definitely
Not the big scary states.
Not the big, and these are all child welfare. So like our next on the, and working with folks like Joyce and others, like the next work here if we're truly oriented towards reproductive justice is to dismantle the child welfare system, which I think is, I hope obvious, but needs to be said. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned cesarean sections, and I actually was in a health law class today, and when you were talking about the ultimate sacrifice to die for the kid, and we read a case about forced C-sections and how if a pregnant mother can't consent if she's deemed incompetent to get a C-section. And when you mentioned that, I think it was in Ireland, and just the anti-abortion community is really pushing towards this, it's a woman's ultimate sacrifice to give up their life for the child. The case that we read today in my health class was really focusing on creating pregnant people as a separate special class, that when they've consented to becoming pregnant, they've consented to giving up, putting their life second to the fetus that they're carrying. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that, of how all of a sudden, this is the case from the 90s, but now in a post-Dobbs world, we're really reaching back towards, not just losing your right to informed consent or consent at all for a C-section, which I don't actually, doesn't exist, but how the mother's or pregnant person's liberty is taken away, and this idea of the ultimate sacrifice of this special class of people. It's kind of not just victimizing, but rising above as this absolute class of people to be protected, but also have given up their rights to protect someone else, and how we can use that anti-abortion perspective a little bit deeper into going past abortion and into something as simple as a C-section or morphine, as I'm so sorry, I forgot your name, but Laura had said.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a quick story because it is a New York case, more recent than the 90s. There's a case that's weaving through the New York state courts right now involving a forced cesarean. This was a mom of two. She had cesareans before, and she really wanted to have a vaginal birth after cesarean, a VBAC. So she left she's in Brooklyn. She decided to have her birth at a Staten Island University hospital. They advertised themselves as VBAC friendly. She made a whole plan. She's religious, and more cesareans meant, and religious, and part of her religion was that she wanted to have a big family. So more cesareans meant the likelihood she would not be able to have more babies safely. So she wanted to have the VBAC. She goes to deliver. She asks to labor longer. They essentially override her refusal to provide informed consent, perform the cesarean against her will, lacerate her bladder, and she, I don't think, can have any more babies after that. It was also incredibly traumatizing. She files a lawsuit, essentially like a medical malpractice lawsuit, added on claims after the fact around discrimination under the New York State human rights law and the New York City human rights law, essentially saying that like you discriminated against her because she's pregnant. You treated her differently because she's pregnant. In discovery, the lawyers discover a policy that the hospital had called overriding maternal refusals. So the only category of adult patients that you can that have capacity, you can override their refusal to provide informed consent are pregnant people. And that was like the smoking gun, so to speak, in the case, that they had a whole process of like, you do this and then you do this, and then you get the Office of Legal Counsel involved, and then you do this, and then you can override their refusal to provide informed consent. So that case is weaving its way through the courts still. It's like been in the court system for 8 years. I think it's at the appellate level. It's gone up and down. But one other thing that I think is important to note is at the lower court, the Superior Court, the opinion of the judge throwing out the case, essentially, that's now been appealed. He cited Roe versus Wade, and he said the state has an interest in fetal life, and therefore this policy is fine, citing Roe. And I'm like, wait, this is a private hospital. There's no state actor here. Like, we're not even, but like, and yet this New York City based judge is like completely messing up like the law, what is a constitutional right, like all these things. And so anyway, that case, I think, is a really good example of this idea that like, yeah, patients are entitled to informed consent unless you are pregnant. And then as a hospital, we've decided that we can override you because, maybe it's this whole dynamic of like, you don't really know what you're talking about. And if you did, you would have given us consent. And we have to balance the interests of the fetus against your own interests. And you lose your rights to full personhood as a pregnant person when you carry a fetus, and because they have rights too.
So since Roe was egregiously wrong the day it was decided, that's no longer a precedent that that judge can rely on, right?
Right. I mean, it was right for many reasons. Yes.
Yeah.
I have no idea how that case will end up. I think it'll go to the Court of Appeals, and it'll be a question of, I think there's some procedural challenges with the case, frankly, because some of the claims are added on too late. I mean, it's kind of a mess, but we'll be there with an amicus brief for sure. Yeah. And those are there's been other cases like that. I mean, a tragic case that Lynn Paltrow, the founder of the organization, worked on in the 80s involved a woman named Angela Carter who learned about. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. So do you want to talk about it, or do you want?
No, go ahead.
Okay. A young woman who had cancer as a child, got married, was pregnant, had a recurrence of cancer, really serious. Like her health, fell apart in like a span. If you read the case, it's in like 10 days. She went from, having sort of some health conditions to being really, to dying. And she had said, I mean, it went up and down through the district court in DC to the DC circuit. And she basically said, like, don't perform the cesarean. She was 24 weeks or 25 weeks, like right at the border of like viability. And her doctors wanted to perform a cesarean to save the fetus as she was about to die. And she was like, don't perform this. I'm not consenting to the cesarean. I want to live as long as possible because I want this baby to have the best chance at life. So don't perform the cesarean yet. Don't perform the cesarean yet. They overrode her. They got a court order. The court said to perform the cesarean. She and the baby both died. And I think Lynn was literally on the phone with her as they were like wheeling her in for surgery.
I remember being on the phone with the general counsel of the
Yes.
hospital because the two of us were working together then, and it was just, we just thought they're not going to do this. They're not going to do this, and then they did. It was just awful.
And the DC Circuit Court decision like apologizes to the family.
Yeah.
Like there's some really remarkable stuff in there about how wrong that decision was.
It's very intense.
So that's the case I was talking about that we read today,
Yeah.
actually.
Oh, yeah.
You read, you see?
We did read
in Ray
AC.
AC,
So it's
yeah.
amazing that you guys, worked on
Well,
that.
Professor Franke did.
You weren't born yet, right?
I was.
Yeah.
That's just to, I guess, like follow up on that real quickly. In that case, I think what was also interesting in reading the facts in the DC court is that there was, it was uncertain if she had removed her consent, right when she they pulled out the tubes and she was able to talk for a little bit. And I think that was really interesting to me is not only how that case defined what a competent individual is. And I mean by the case, like the dissent and the concurrence, how they define like what's competence to give it, but also what is consent. And just because she was groggy when she removed her consent, that it didn't count. They could do, as you said, like overriding the maternal request. And I guess like giving doctors that much agency. Again, in health law, we really talked about who decides and like how much power the physician has. And here we're talking about the state. But it's just really amazing to know that you guys worked on that case.
Yeah, that was a horrible case. There's so many heartbreakers in this field
Yeah.
we work in.
I know, and what's interesting is there was a lot written about that case, and people anticipated more of those kinds of cases. And I'd be interested in hearing what you think about how like people thought that there'd be a circuit split, like people were getting ready, and there were like law articles from the early 90s that were like preparing for this and coming up with legal strategy, and it really didn't play out that way. It went much more in the direction of criminalization. I mean, we have had those court order cases, but they're much, much more unusual than the criminal cases.
I seem to remember it getting kind of tied up in Cruzan also in the
Oh,
right to
yeah.
die cases
Yeah.
and patient autonomy or agency at the end of their lives. And because she knew she was dying and she was trying to live as long as possible so that the fetus would be as old as possible when she passed. It very much got tied up in that right to die litigation and the politics of that. And she was white, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was white. And I think so much of the focus then shifted to women of color and the criminal justice system as sort of the site of where there was a lot of action.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Antonia.
Hello, Laura. I'm from Brazil, and in Brazil we have abortions in 3 cases. If you are raped, if it's a risk for the person who is conducting the pregnancy, and if there is no chance to the baby to survive. But even in these 3 cases, we are seeing a movement that are trying to work against them. And recently a case that was a 11 years old girl. She was in front of a judge, a woman judge, that was saying to her that basically using phantom personhood's speech, because she was saying that the girl would hurt her child, although it was not a child. She even used the word father to describe the rapist, and that the girl would regret. So using this logic of is her
All the greatest hits. Yeah.
all the greatest hits, yeah. And since I follow like news, I have never seen a debate in Brazil so like public. All the headlines were talking about this case, and she almost became this martyr you mentioned. At the end, she got the abortion, but after a lot of exposure and beyond the rape, also all the mental problematics of being in front of a judge. And I wonder, how do you see these connections, like broadly, transnational. So how do you see what happens here in the United States? The speeches, the policies that are being proposed, the bills impact other countries, and also what happens in other countries impacts what happens here. Because, for example, what we saw in Argentina or in Colombia, I do feel that it speed up the public awareness about this cause, but also anti-abortions activists. So how do you perceive this connection? And if you feel that what happened in Colombia, Argentina is speed up also the fetal personhood movement here in the United States?
Yeah. I am by no means an expert on what's happening in the Americas, but I think it is remarkable that as many countries are liberalizing their abortion laws in really amazing ways, we're sort of, you know, if you look, there was a lot of stats that came out after the Dobbs decision that, like, you know, there's like a dozen or more countries that are moving in the opposite direction of the US, and we're like in the same categories like Poland and maybe one other country that's moving more regressive. And so we're certainly like bucking the international trend, or like against the trend when it comes to liberalizing abortion laws. But I also worry a lot about exporting what's happening here. And that I just saw a headline, today about anti-abortion activists in the US like spreading the gospel, like their work, and using their tactics in the UK. Like, so and we saw sort of like Trump and his brand of politics like impact the Philippines and Brazil and like lots of other countries, and like fascist regimes popping up. And I think that like we are so ignorant if we don't think that like this will have an impact in other places. So I don't know. I mean, I find a lot of hope in what's happening in certain states in Mexico and Argentina and Colombia and elsewhere. There are women in Mexico who are sending pills to the US, like thousands of pills. There's a network now of women in Mexico who are just helping American women or people in America access medication abortion pills, and they're like can do it because it's legal where they are, and they're outside of our jurisdiction. And so like thank goodness for that. But I worry about everything gets normalized so quickly. Like within a few weeks of the decision, we already had language. We already were talking about access states and ban states. Like, I was like, wait, how did we all agree on what we call this? Like, we've already figured out that like, and it was so normal already. Like, oh, we're in an access, what can access states do to help the ban? And I'm like, what? So I just worry that as this becomes more normalized, the longer this goes on, it'll spread. And you know, anti-abortion activists are very well funded, and they'll go and they'll take their strategy to other places, and that's scary. I wish I had a better answer.
On that note, a version of that recently in Ghana, there's the passage of that, I guess, the introduction of a horribly anti-LGBTQIA+ law. And then Kamala Harris went and was like, no. And then the president of Ghana was like, it hasn't passed yet. Yikes. So that's totally something that like the US from like a diplomatic perspective seems to be, there's precedent for what you've pointed out. So, but my question was, I was wondering if you could speak to the complexities, the urgency of a trans-inclusive pregnant people's rights movement, the ways in which generalizing language around pregnant people, degendering it is both necessary, but also how to hold space for the trans-specific experiences of pregnancy.
Yeah.
Bundle a couple of questions because I still see a lot of hands. Natasha, was that your hand up yet?
Yeah, since we were talking about international countries, there was a case recently in Dominican Republic where abortion's completely illegal, and the headlines had nothing to do with the right to access, abortion rights, like women equality, had nothing to do with that. All the headlines had to do with stereotyping. They stereotyped the victim, who was a high school girl, and then they stereotyped the parents, saying that the parents were bad parents. But there was nothing about
health laws, nothing about access, nothing. And even actual like Dominican lawyers were focusing on these stereotypes like morality and this girl was so fast, like not even the person who raped her or was having an inappropriate relationship with, which was her high school teacher, that wasn't in the headlines. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think gender stereotypes and like these type of like these things that shroud the actual issue, can that be overcome, or how can that be overcome in countries like Dominican Republic and smaller countries where abortion is outright illegal?
Okay, you got two tough questions.
Okay. So on trans inclusive reproductive justice rights vision, I completely agree that this movement must be, and like I slip up and sometimes say pregnant women in my conversation today too. We changed our name last year, way too late, but we finally did it. I think that this is all the same. Like this is literally, and there's a great article out today. I just like skimmed, I think in New York Magazine, about the blueprint that applies equally to anti-trans legislation, anti-abortion legislation. I mean, we're talking about bodily autonomy, medical decision-making, the right to parent, access states and ban states, like government intrusion in our personal decisions. Like this is these are people that are supposed to be the small government, like whatever people. Like this is the exact opposite because it's in service of something that they are afraid of. I also think, as we talked about, like the backlash, there is visibility more than ever. So there is fear, and there is, this loss of power, this loss of norms or shifting of norms. All of that is the same. If we think about like people owning their sexuality and choosing not to be parents and celebrating that, and, not, being afraid to talk about their abortion experiences and being out there and proud about that. Same with living your true self and being out and proud and being trans and being gender non-binary, non-binary, non-conforming, like it's all a backlash. And so we have to work, there's no other way in my view. And I think that, the backlash, like even when we see it, like with our name change and stuff, the idea that like you're erasing women and like this is, I don't want to be reduced to my like parts, like people with the capacity for pregnancy or people with uteruses or whatever. And my response to that, which is not particularly creative, is like, no, like the umbrella is big enough. It's for women. It's for people with the capacity for pregnancy. It's for all of us. Like that doesn't diminish your experience as a woman. We're just expanding the umbrella, like everyone come in, like, let's just make it a bigger, and it's the same tactics. Like, we can't repeat the same patterns. I think one of the reasons why we are where we are is because reproductive rights had been so siloed, and I think part of it was also the people in the movement so siloed from every other fight for justice. When we're thinking about voting rights, LGBTQ rights, racial justice, criminal justice, we were just out there probably because no one else, in part, I think because abortion was stigmatized, but also because I don't think that people saw the connections, and the reproductive rights movement didn't see the connections. So yes, to all of that. On that, I don't know specifically like the specific dynamics in the Dominican Republic, but I think what has been transformative for the reproductive rights and justice movement in the past, let's say 10 years, is this idea of abortion storytelling. There's an organization called We Testify that has really changed the game on this. And it is just like unapologetic, talking about your abortion experiences, the good, the bad, the ugly. It's not one narrative. It's not like a privileged white girl who gets driven to the Planned Parenthood by their best friend, and it's like a romantic comedy. Like, it's not that. It's all of the messy things that happen. It's talking realistically about what it's like to go through a medication abortion at home. Like, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the fact that I've had multiple abortions. Let's talk about the fact that I have kids and I'm getting an abortion. Like, there has been a groundswell of people who are talking about their abortion experiences and normalizing it. And for years, there's been briefs filed with the Supreme Court in abortion cases where people talk about their own abortion experiences. And I think it was like a Lawrence versus Texas strategy where all the story in Lawrence versus Texas, which decriminalized the anti-sodomy law in Texas, was all the law. I think this is true. And I'm not just, this is not just urban legend, but Pamela Karlan talks about this. Like, a bunch of clerks who clerked for Supreme Court justices who were gay all showed up for the argument, and they all sat in the front area, and they were all like, you were going to pretend that you don't know a gay person. Well, all of us are here, and you all know us, and you all love us. To the justices, that was the message to the justices. That was like a really radical thing at the time. There have been briefs filed at the Supreme Court with people sharing their abortion experiences. In fact, there was a brief filed, and it was like all fancy lady lawyers who like talked about their abortion. It was like partners at law firms and the former like assistant solicitor general and former law professors, Supreme Court clerks. And it was like, I had an abortion and it changed my life, and it allowed me to become the person I became. And then there was another brief file that We Testify helped organize that was like, I don't know, it was like thousands of signatures. Like it was basically just a brief of signatures of people who were just like, we all had abortions and it allowed us to be the people that we are now. And it was just, and you could sign up like through a Google form to add your name. And like I had friends, moms who had abortions pre-Roe sign it. I mean, and it was just this idea that like, we have to talk about it, and this cannot be shameful, and it's a normal experience. And so that has been revolutionary in the US. I think the reproductive rights movement was not saying the word abortion 20 years ago. Even the people in the movement weren't saying it, just like you were talking about, like the lawyers for this, in this case. We can't do that. We have to be unapologetic about it.
All right, I'm going to stop you for 1 second. We're almost out of time. Can people come work with you?
Sure.
How does that work?
Yeah. So you could always go to our website is pregnancyjusticeus.org. Pregnancyjustice.org was taken. So it's a little longer than we would have liked. You can always email info@pregnancyjusticeus.org and get, someone will respond to you. We, I think we take interns during the year. So part-time, we pay, can be remote. But we have a New York City office if you do want to see people. And we also take summer interns, of course. And we do also seek fellows to get external funding. We have one internally funded fellow, and we work with folks to get external funding for fellowships every year. We have a class of, I think, 3 fellows typically. So please follow us on social media at Pregnancy Just on all the platforms, not on TikTok. Questionable about whether that will exist or be banned or whatever, or Twitter too. But so please follow us, follow along for updates on our work, and reach out to me too if you'd like. I'm dana.s@pregnancyjusticeus.org.
Thank you.